He thought his little boy would never hear another sound. But years later, one small mistake exposed a truth so powerful it shattered their perfect world. What the new nanny discovered inside that silent mansion will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching? The morning sun spilled golden light across the Miller estate, brushing over marble steps and ivy-draped walls. From the outside, the mansion looked like something carved out of an old dream, tall, majestic, and utterly perfect. But perfection, as everyone in the town knew, could sometimes hide the deepest cracks. Inside, silence ruled like an invisible king. Every sound seemed cautious there. The click of a servant's shoe, the faint clatter of silver spoons, even the ticking of the grand clock in the hallway, all seemed afraid to be too loud. That was because of the miller's only child, Ethan, the boy with soft brown curls and eyes that looked too old for his age. At 8 years old, he was said to be deaf, and everything in that house revolved around that belief. When Ethan was 3, the doctors had spoken in low, serious voices. Congenital hearing loss, they said, showing charts and scans Edward Miller couldn't fully understand. His wife Clara had cried for weeks. Edward, a proud businessman known for never losing control, had felt his world fall apart that day. He decided that if his son would live in silence, then silence would become sacred. From that moment, music vanished from their home. Parties grew quieter. The laughter that once echoed through the halls simply disappeared. Years passed, and Ethan grew into a quiet shadow. He communicated through signs that his parents learned from specialists, but conversations were brief, limited, and often filled with awkward pauses. He smiled sometimes, but it always looked like a polite habit, not true joy. He spent hours in the garden sketching, staring at the sky, or sitting by the pond where the water reflected the only life that seemed to move freely. Then, one late summer morning, Grace Carter arrived. She was 24. Freshly trained as a child caretaker, with a calm confidence that didn't fit her humble appearance. Her brown hair was tied loosely, and her clothes were simple but neat. She had come to the mansion with a sense of hope. It was her first big job, and the miller's reputation promised stability. Yet as soon as she stepped inside, she felt something unusual. The air was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Clara greeted her kindly, but without warmth. "You'll find everything you need in the West Wing," she said softly, glancing upstairs as if afraid to disturb someone. "Ethan prefers quiet company. He doesn't respond to much, but he's gentle," Grace nodded. "I understand," but she didn't. Not yet. The first time she met Ethan, he was sitting on the floor near a window, arranging wooden blocks. Sunlight fell on his face, and for a moment she thought he looked like a painting, distant, fragile, and too still. When she approached, he didn't look up. She smiled, sat nearby, and began building her own small tower beside his. After a few minutes, she whispered, almost instinctively, "That's beautiful." Of course, she didn't expect him to react. But something subtle happened, a tiny pause in his movements. He didn't look at her, yet his hand stopped mid-air for a second, as if a whisper had brushed against his mind. Then he continued, as if nothing had happened. Grace blinked. Maybe it was her imagination. The days turned into quiet routines. Grace read picture books aloud, even though everyone told her it was useless. She talked to him about the garden, about clouds, about the silly cat that always stole food from the kitchen. Ethan never responded, but she kept talking anyway. There was something in his eyes, something that didn't match the story everyone believed. One afternoon, she was tidying up his toys when a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. The sound echoed sharply through the room. Ethan jerked, not much, but enough for her to notice. His shoulders tensed, his head tilted slightly toward the sound. Grace's breath caught. She said nothing, pretending not to notice, but her mind raced. That reaction hadn't been random. Over the next few days, she began to test small things. She would hum softly while sorting books. She would tap her pencil against the table in rhythm. Once she deliberately let a spoon drop to the floor. Each time, she saw it. The flicker of recognition in Ethan's eyes, the subtle twitch of his hand, the faint change in his breathing. He could hear something. Maybe not everything, but something. At night, Grace couldn't sleep. She replayed each moment in her mind, uncertain what to believe. Could the doctors have been wrong? Or was she misreading the boy's body language because she wanted to help too much? It wasn't her place to challenge the Millers. She needed this job. Still, something inside her whispered, a child's truth shouldn't be buried under fear. One evening, she found Ethan drawing by the window again. The light was fading. Shadows stretched long across the floor. She walked quietly to him and looked at his paper. He was drawing a scene of a park, trees, benches, birds, and at the edge, a little boy covering his ears, while other children laughed. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. "That's very good," she said softly. Ethan didn't look up, but she thought she saw his lips tremble. Then outside, a dog barked sharply. For a split second, Ethan's hand froze. His eyes darted toward the window. It was unmistakable. Grace's heart pounded. "Ethan," she whispered. "Can you hear the dog?" He froze completely, staring at his paper. No response. But his silence felt different, like a wall built out of fear rather than deafness. Later that night, she stood in the kitchen washing cups when Mrs. Miller entered quietly. "You're doing well with him," Clara said, almost whispering. Grace smiled gently. "He's a wonderful boy." "Yes, he is," Clara replied, her eyes distant. "I wish things were different. Sometimes I dream of hearing him call me Mommy." "Just once." Her voice broke. "But we must accept what we're given, mustn't we?" Grace wanted to say something, to ask if they ever doubted the diagnosis, but she stopped herself. The pain in Clara's eyes was too raw, too heavy to question. That night, as the house fell into its usual hush, Grace sat near her window, listening to the faint rustle of the trees outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that the real silence in that home wasn't Ethan's. It belonged to everyone else. The next morning, while the family had breakfast, the mansion's calm was interrupted by a sudden accident. A glass pitcher slipped from a servant's hand and shattered on the marble floor. The sound was piercing. Ethan, who was seated quietly beside his mother, flinched violently. His hands shot to his ears, his whole body shaking. Everyone froze, the servants gasped. Clara instinctively reached for him, but he pushed her hands away, burying his face. Edward's brow furrowed in confusion. "What's wrong with him?" he asked sharply, his deep voice breaking the quiet. Grace's pulse raced. She couldn't look away. That wasn't the reaction of a deaf child. That was a reaction to sound. But before she could speak, Edward said firmly, "He's just startled by the vibrations. It happens." His tone left no room for argument. The servants began cleaning the shards in silence. Grace watched Ethan trembling, her heart aching with realization. Later, when she walked him to the garden, she noticed him glancing back toward the dining room door again and again, as if something about that sound still haunted him. She knelt beside him, speaking in a low, tender voice. "Ethan, it's okay. It was just a glass. It made a loud sound. You don't have to be scared." For a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers, deep, searching, uncertain. She smiled reassuringly, and he looked away, pretending to be busy with a leaf on the ground. But Grace knew what she saw in those eyes: understanding, awareness. She spent the rest of the day in quiet thought. Maybe he wasn't pretending not to hear. Maybe he had learned that hearing was wrong, that the world didn't want him to respond, that his silence kept the peace. The idea sent shivers through her. That evening, while writing in her notebook, she penned a single line. "Sometimes, what we call silence is just fear in disguise." From that moment, Grace made a decision. She would not let this child live, buried under someone else's mistake. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she would find the truth, because somewhere behind those frightened eyes, a little boy was still waiting to be heard. Grace woke up the next morning with a strange heaviness in her chest. The mansion, as always, was still, too still. Even the birds outside seemed to sing more softly here, as if afraid their voices might offend the walls. She got dressed quietly and went to check on Ethan. He was sitting near the window again, watching sunlight slip through the curtains like thin golden ribbons. She stood there for a while, just observing him. His small hands rested on his knees, his eyes distant yet alive, following every movement of the leaves outside. For someone the world believed couldn't hear, he seemed to sense rhythm in everything. The flutter of a curtain, the hush of wind, even the heartbeat of silence itself. "Good morning," Grace said softly, even though she knew he wasn't supposed to respond. She placed a plate of toast on the small table beside him and sat down. For a long while, neither of them moved. Then when she lifted her teacup, the porcelain made a faint clink against the saucer, and Ethan blinked. Just once, quick but real. Her heart skipped a beat. "You felt that?" she whispered under her breath. He turned slightly toward her voice, though his eyes stayed fixed on the garden. Grace drew in a quiet breath. This wasn't her imagination anymore. Something inside her, that same instinct that made her good with children, told her she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a simple mistake. That day, she began to observe him with quiet precision. During lessons, she would tap a rhythm on the desk while pretending to count objects. Ethan's eyes followed her fingers. When she opened a music box in another corner of the room, he would look toward it, as though drawn by something familiar but forbidden. In the afternoons, when they walked in the garden, she would hum softly to herself. Sometimes she thought she saw him walk a little slower, as though his feet tried to match her melody. It was subtle, heartbreakingly subtle, but it was there. The truth whispered between them like wind through old branches. Days passed this way. The mansion's routines never changed. Edward Miller remained a man of quiet pride and unbending control. He came home late from his business office, barely glancing at his son before locking himself away in the study. Clara tried to fill the silence with polite smiles, but Grace could see how exhaustion lived behind her eyes. Every evening after the family's formal dinner, Grace would sit with Ethan near the piano room. No one had touched the piano in years. Its polished wood was covered with a faint layer of dust, like the memory of forgotten songs. She would sometimes brush her fingers over the keys, but never press them, fearing it might disturb the peace. One night, however, something changed. It was raining outside. The steady drumming of drops filled the air with a soft rhythm. Ethan was curled up on the couch with his sketchbook. Grace was reading nearby when thunder cracked in the distance, loud and sudden. Ethan jumped, his pencil dropping from his hand. His body stiffened, eyes wide. Grace's breath caught. She stood slowly and knelt beside him. "Ethan, are you all right?" He didn't move. His gaze darted toward the window, then back to her, his lips trembling, as though something inside him was fighting to stay hidden. Grace hesitated for a heartbeat, then said quietly, "You heard that, didn't you?" "Nothing, only the rain tapping on the glass." But then the faintest nod. Her heart almost stopped. He had nodded. "Ethan," she whispered, voice trembling, "you can hear me." "Can't you?" He looked at her now, really looked, and tears filled his eyes. One rolled down his cheek. Grace reached out gently, her voice soft as breath. "It's all right. You don't have to be afraid." He turned his face away, shaking his head quickly, wiping the tears with small, nervous hands. Grace wanted to ask more, but she could see the fear tightening every muscle in his body. Whatever he was hiding, it wasn't simple disobedience, it was survival. That night, Grace lay awake in her small room. She could hear the rain still whispering against the windows, and every drop seemed to echo with a question. Why is he pretending? Who made him afraid of the truth? She thought of Edward's sharp tone, the way Clara never contradicted him, the way the staff tiptoed around the family as though walking on glass. Maybe Ethan had learned that silence was safer. The next morning, she decided to understand him in his world, not force him into hers. She began communicating through games, art, and expression. Instead of direct questions, she used play. She drew pictures of sounds, thunderclouds, bells, birds, and watched how his eyes reacted. She noticed he always stared longer at the bell, so one day She brought a small silver bell from the kitchen. She set it on the table beside his toys. "It's pretty, isn't it?" she said softly, pretending to admire its shine. He looked at it but didn't touch it. Then she picked it up, gave it a gentle shake, and a bright chime filled the room. Ethan flinched. Not much, but enough. Grace set it down slowly, meeting his eyes. "You heard that?" He stared at her, frozen between fear and longing. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can trust me." His eyes filled again. Then so faint she almost missed it. His lips moved. "One word, please." Grace froze. "What did you say?" But he pressed his small hands against his ears, shaking his head, whispering again, "Please don't tell." Her chest tightened. The sound of his voice, soft, trembling but perfectly clear, struck her like lightning. She nodded quickly, her own eyes wet. "I won't. I promise." He exhaled shakily, lowering his hands, his whole body trembling with the weight of relief. Grace knelt in front of him and smiled. "You don't have to hide from me, Ethan." For a long time he said nothing. Then he whispered, "They don't believe me." Grace's breath caught. "Who?" He hesitated. "Mama, Daddy, the doctor." And then, like a floodgate slowly opening, the truth came out in broken whispers, pauses, and tears. He told her that when he was small, he used to react to sounds, laugh at music, call out to his parents. But his father didn't believe it. The doctor had said it was phantom hearing, just a mind trick, not real. His father told him to stop pretending, to stop giving false hope to his mother. So he did. He stopped speaking. He stopped reacting. He built his world around silence because silence made everyone less angry. Grace listened with tears streaming down her face. Each word he spoke felt like a wound cut years ago, finally opening to heal. "Oh, Ethan," she murmured. "You've been so brave." He looked up at her, eyes shimmering. "It hurts when they look at me like I'm broken." Grace took his hand gently. "You're not broken, sweetheart. You're just unheard." He looked at her for a long moment, searching perhaps for disbelief, but found none. For the first time, his shoulders relaxed. Over the next few days, a new secret bond grew between them. She began speaking softly near him, and he would respond in small ways. A nod, a shy smile, sometimes even a whispered word. They laughed quietly together over stories she read aloud. Grace began to feel hope blooming in the air again, but with hope came danger. One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Edward Miller appeared suddenly, tall and stern as ever. His eyes narrowed. "Grace," he said curtly, "I've noticed you speak quite a bit around Ethan. You do realize he can't hear you?" Grace froze. Ethan tensed beside her. "I just like to talk," she replied carefully. "It keeps the day bright," Edward frowned. "That's unnecessary. It only reminds Clara of what she's lost." His tone softened slightly but remained distant. "Please refrain from useless chatter." He walked away before she could answer. Ethan's hand found hers, small and trembling. His eyes pleaded silently. "Don't tell." She squeezed his hand in promise. That evening, Clara visited the playroom. She seemed tired, fragile, her face pale. "Grace," she said softly, "you've done wonders with Ethan. He seems calmer, happier." Grace smiled gently. "He's a very special boy." "Yes," Clara said wistfully. "Sometimes I wonder what his voice would sound like." Grace almost said, "It's beautiful," but bit her tongue. After Clara left, Grace sat down on the rug, feeling the storm building quietly around them. The truth she now held in her heart was too big, too powerful, and too dangerous to keep forever. But she couldn't expose Ethan's trust. Not yet. Later that night, as the mansion slept, she heard soft footsteps outside her door. When she opened it, Ethan stood there clutching his sketchbook. His eyes were wide but determined. He handed it to her. On the page was a drawing of her standing in front of him, her hand outstretched toward a boy who was covering his ears. Above them he had written a single word, "Listen." Grace's throat tightened. She knelt, hugging him gently. "I hear you, Ethan," she whispered. "I promise. I always will." And for the first time since she had arrived, she heard a sound in the mansion that had been missing for years. A small, fragile laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. But it was real. And it was just the beginning. The next few days passed like quiet waves, slow, fragile, and filled with a kind of peace that Grace hadn't felt since she arrived at the Miller mansion. For the first time, Ethan seemed lighter. He smiled more often, even if only in brief flickers. When she spoke softly, he no longer flinched. Instead, he would tilt his head, listening. Each time, Grace felt a small spark of victory, a whisper of life returning to a world long muted, but the mansion itself didn't change. Its silence remained thick, the kind that hides beneath chandeliers and marble floors. Edward's footsteps still echoed in steady, cold rhythm. Clara still moved like a ghost through the hallways, her smile delicate but fading at the edges. The servants spoke in hushed tones. No laughter, no music, just the sound of existence pretending to be content. One afternoon, Grace and Ethan sat in the library. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny golden sparks. Ethan was sketching again, his tongue peeking slightly from the corner of his mouth, a habit he had when he was focused. Grace watched quietly, her heart softening. He had drawn two figures under a large tree, one small, one taller, both surrounded by birds. "It was them. That's beautiful," she said gently. He smiled faintly but didn't look up. Then she noticed something unusual. On the far corner of the paper, he had drawn a black cloud, dark and heavy, unlike the rest of the picture. "What's that?" she asked softly. He hesitated before whispering, "That's what happens when Daddy comes." Grace's heart ached. "Does your father make you scared, Ethan?" He didn't answer, just stared at the drawing, his small fingers tightening around the pencil. "He gets angry when I try to talk, even to your mom." "Especially then," Ethan whispered, almost trembling. He said it hurts her more. Grace felt her throat tighten. She understood now. The silence in this house wasn't medical, it was emotional. It had been built from pain and pride. A wall Edward Miller had constructed to protect himself from disappointment and to hide from guilt. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, Grace lingered in the hallway, her thoughts tangled. She wanted to help, but how could she? Telling the parents outright might break more than it healed. Edward's pride could turn into rage, and Clara's fragile hope could crumble. And what if they accused her of manipulating their child? Her job and Ethan's safety could vanish in an instant, but keeping quiet felt equally wrong. She had seen the truth, and truth had a way of demanding to be heard. The next morning she made a quiet plan. If she couldn't tell the father directly, she would help Ethan show him. Over the next week, she began to teach Ethan through games that used sound in small, safe ways. She would clap softly and let him mimic the rhythm. She played simple guessing games, tapping objects and letting him point to the source. At first he hesitated, afraid that someone might see. But soon, confidence began to bloom in his eyes. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in amber hues, Grace brought Ethan to the piano room again. "Do you want to hear something?" she whispered. He hesitated, but then nodded. She lifted the piano lid. The keys gleamed faintly, untouched for years. Her fingers hovered above them, trembling slightly. Then she pressed one. A single soft note drifted through the air like a breath. Ethan's eyes widened. He looked around, then back at her, as if trying to confirm what his heart already knew. She played another note, then another, until a gentle melody filled the air, weaving through the room like sunlight after rain. Ethan stood, frozen. Then slowly he stepped closer, his small hand reaching out to touch the vibrating wood. A smile, pure, awestruck, alive, spread across his face. Grace's vision blurred with tears. "You can hear it, can't you?" she whispered. He nodded. "Do you like it?" He nodded again, more eagerly this time. And then, without thinking, he whispered a word she hadn't heard him say before. "Beautiful." Grace's heart broke and healed in the same moment. That small voice, trembling but clear, was everything this house had been missing, but just then, a sound behind them. A deep, sharp voice. "What are you doing?" Grace froze. Ethan turned pale. Edward Miller stood at the doorway, his face stern, his voice low and heavy. "Why are you playing the piano?" His eyes narrowed. "He can't hear you." Grace rose slowly, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Mr. Miller, please, I told you before, Edward interrupted coldly. Do not waste time on things that don't concern you. Ethan shrank behind her, gripping her hand. Grace felt his tiny fingers tremble. Sir, she said carefully, with all respect, it does concern me. Ethan, enough! Edward's tone cut through the air like glass. You were hired to care for him, not to chase fantasies. Grace opened her mouth again, but then Ethan, trembling, stepped forward. Daddy? He whispered. Edward blinked. His eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering in them. What did you just... Ethan's lips trembled. I can hear. For a heartbeat the world stopped. The air seemed to vanish. Edward stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. Ethan, don't do this. Don't make your mother hope again. I'm not lying, Ethan said, louder now, tears streaking down his face. I can hear, Daddy. Edward's face hardened. Enough. He turned to Grace, fury flashing in his eyes. This is your doing. You've filled his head with nonsense. Grace stepped forward, voice shaking but firm. No, Mr. Miller, this is truth. Your son can hear. He has been able to hear all along. Stop. His tone was sharp. You're crossing a line. I saw him react to sounds, to thunder, to music, to voices. He hears, Mr. Miller. You've built his world on silence because it's easier than admitting you were wrong. Her words hung heavy in the air. Edward's jaw tightened, but behind his anger was something else. Fear. Do you think I want this? Do you think I haven't prayed for it every day? The doctors were clear. The doctors were wrong, Grace said, her eyes glistening. And you believed them because you were too afraid to believe your son, Ethan sobbed quietly beside her, his small body shaking. Please, Daddy, he whispered. I don't want to be quiet anymore. Edward looked down at his son, at the tears, the trembling lips, the desperate little hands, and something inside him cracked. Years of denial, pride, and guilt seemed to crumble all at once. He sank to one knee, his voice breaking for the first time in years. Ethan, can you really hear me? The boy nodded. I always could. Edward reached out, hesitating, then pulled him into his arms. The child clung to him, crying softly. Grace turned away, tears streaming down her own face. Clara, who had been drawn by the commotion, appeared at the doorway. When she saw them, her husband holding their son, both crying, she covered her mouth in shock. Edward, what's happening? Edward looked up, voice raw. He can hear, Clara. Our boy can hear. Clara's knees buckled and she fell beside them, gathering Ethan into her arms. Oh, my darling, she sobbed. Oh, my sweet boy. She kissed his forehead again and again, her tears falling into his hair. All these years. We didn't believe you. Ethan clung to her, whispering, I'm sorry, Mummy. No, love, she cried. We're sorry. The house that had been silent for years now echoed with the sounds of sobbing, laughter, disbelief, the sounds of life returning after a long sleep. Edward turned to Grace, eyes red. How did you know? Grace wiped her tears. I didn't know at first. I just listened. Edward looked away, shame flooding his features. I should have listened too. That night no one slept. The family sat together in the living room, holding Ethan close, afraid to let go. Grace stayed with them quietly, watching as the boy's laughter, shy but genuine, filled the room. Clara held his small hand as if trying to memorize the sound of his giggles. Edward kept staring at him, shaking his head, whispering, My son, my brave boy. Before going to bed, Ethan turned to Grace. Thank you, he said softly. Grace smiled, kneeling down to meet his eyes. You don't have to thank me, Ethan. You did the hardest part. You found your voice. He smiled sleepily and hugged her tightly. You heard me when no one else did. Her heart swelled. I'll always hear you, she whispered. When he went upstairs with his parents, Grace stood in the quiet hall. For the first time since she arrived, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not haunted, just peaceful. But she knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out, but healing would take time. Guilt had deep roots and trust needed to grow again. Still, that night, as she walked past the grand piano, she brushed her fingers along the keys and smiled. From upstairs, she could hear faint laughter, a father, a mother, and a little boy rediscovering sound together. For the first time in years, the Miller mansion was alive again. The next morning rose like a quiet promise. Sunlight streamed gently through the tall windows of the Miller mansion, carrying with it a warmth that had been missing for years. The old house, once shrouded in silence, seemed to breathe again. The air was softer, lighter, as if every wall and corridor had been waiting for this awakening. Grace woke early, drawn by the faintest sound. Laughter, real unguarded laughter. For a moment she lay still, listening to it echo down the hallway. It was Ethan's. There was music in that sound, a melody that needed no piano to be beautiful. She rose from bed and quietly made her way to the garden. There, under the golden glow of dawn, Ethan was chasing bubbles that Clara was blowing into the air. The little boy's laughter mingled with the morning breeze, wrapping everything in an invisible thread of joy. Clara's eyes were brighter, her movements freer. She looked like a woman who had just remembered how to live. A few steps away, Edward stood watching them. His usual stiffness was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. His arms were crossed loosely, not in defense but in awe, as though he still couldn't believe the sight before him. Grace approached softly. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." He turned, giving her a faint, tired smile, but a real one. "Good morning, Grace. I don't remember the last time I heard my house sound like this." "It suits the place," she said warmly. "It was never meant to stay silent." Edward nodded, his gaze distant. "You were right about everything," he admitted quietly. "I let fear blind me. I convinced myself that silence was safer than hope." Grace looked at him gently. "We all build walls when we're scared, sir. Some people use words. Others use silence." He took a deep breath, the kind that carries years of unspoken guilt. "I thought I was protecting my family. After the diagnosis, Clara broke down completely. I told myself that if we just accepted it, if we learned to live without sound, it would hurt less. But all I did was bury us alive." Grace didn't reply. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. A few minutes later, Ethan ran up to her, breathless, holding a small flower in his hand. "For you," he said cheerfully. "Mom says flowers help people smile." Grace knelt, smiling. "And what about you, Ethan? Do you smile because of flowers?" He giggled. "I smile because I can hear them now." She laughed softly. "Hear them?" He nodded seriously. "When the wind moves through them, they make a sound. It's tiny, but it's there. I never heard that before." Her heart swelled. The boy who once lived in silence now noticed even the whispers of the wind. Later that day, Clara insisted they all sit together for lunch, something they hadn't done in years. The dining room, once stiff and cold, was filled with sunlight and chatter. Ethan talked endlessly about his drawings, the piano, the way the rain sounded against the window last night. Edward listened to every word, his eyes glistening with both pride and regret. Occasionally, he reached across the table to touch Ethan's hand, as if to reassure himself that this was real. After lunch, Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, can you come to the piano room? I want to show you something." Edward hesitated, but Clara nodded encouragingly. Grace followed quietly as they entered the same room where everything had changed. The grand piano gleamed softly in the afternoon light, no longer a relic of sorrow, but a symbol of rebirth. Ethan climbed onto the piano bench, his feet dangling above the floor. Grace stood behind him, guiding gently. "Remember what we practiced?" she asked softly. He nodded, his small fingers finding the keys. He pressed one, a hesitant, soft note. Then another. Slowly, a tune began to form, uneven, uncertain, but undeniably beautiful. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Edward stepped closer, his lips parting in disbelief. "He's playing?" Grace smiled. "He memorized what I played that night." When Ethan finished, he turned to his father expectantly. "Did I do okay?" Edward didn't answer right away. His throat tightened, and he had to swallow hard before speaking. "You did more than okay, son. You made music," Ethan grinned. "Can we play together next time?" Edward hesitated. "I don't know how." Ethan's voice was innocent, pure. "Then I can teach you." For the first time, Edward laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that filled the room. "Deal," he said, bending to hug his son. Grace watched the scene quietly. Her job was supposed to be just to care for a boy, but somehow she had helped heal an entire family. That evening after dinner, Edward asked her to join him in his study. The room, once intimidating with its heavy oak furniture and strict order, now felt warmer. A small lamp glowed on the desk, casting golden light over papers and books. "I owe you an apology," he began, his tone humble. "I treated you unfairly. I didn't want to believe you, because it meant admitting I'd been wrong for years. I pushed you away when you were trying to help." Grace shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Miller. You just needed time." He looked at her, eyes sincere. "You gave my family more than time, Grace. You gave us back our son." "I'll never forget that," she smiled softly. "You didn't lose him. You just couldn't hear him, until now. There was silence between them, but it was a different kind, peaceful, alive." The next day, Grace packed her things. Her time as Ethan's caretaker was over, but she couldn't help feeling like she was leaving a part of herself behind. The boy had changed her too, reminded her why she had chosen to care for others in the first place. As she folded the last of her clothes, a knock came at her door. It was Ethan, holding a small box wrapped in blue ribbon. "Is that for me?" she asked. He nodded eagerly. "Mom said you're going away, but I don't want you to forget me." Grace took the box, opening it carefully. Inside was a drawing, a large tree with two figures beneath it holding hands. The same drawing he'd made before, only now there was a third figure, taller, smiling with long hair. "That's you," Ethan said proudly. "You're part of our family now." Tears blurred her vision. She hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Ethan. I'll never forget you," he whispered. "Will you come back someday?" She smiled, brushing his hair back. "Maybe one day. But for now, I think you have everything you need." When she stepped outside, Clara and Edward were waiting by the car. Clara hugged her warmly, tears in her eyes. "You've given me my son back." "There are no words for that," Grace smiled. "You gave him love. I just helped him find the courage to use it." Edward extended his hand, but then, hesitating, pulled her into a brief hug instead. "Thank you," he said quietly. As the car drove away, Grace looked back at the mansion. Through the window she saw Ethan waving, his laughter faint but clear, even over the sound of the engine. The house that once held sorrow now radiated life. Weeks later, Grace received a letter. It was from Ethan. The handwriting was messy but full of heart. "Dear Miss Grace, I learned a new song. Daddy plays the piano with me now. Mommy sings sometimes, even though she cries when she does. The house is full of sounds, birds, music, rain, and love. I think that's what you wanted. Thank you for helping me hear it all. Love, Ethan." Grace read it again and again, tears rolling down her cheeks. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her journal, whispering to herself, "You did it, little one." Outside her window, wind rustled through the trees. For a moment she closed her eyes and listened to the rustle, the hum, the living world around her. And she smiled, because she realized something profound. Sometimes we are sent to heal others, only to discover that they were healing us all along. The story of the boy who lived in silence had become something greater, a story of courage, forgiveness and love, and somewhere in a house that once knew only silence, a piano played softly, not a song of sorrow, but one of hope. The sound of life had finally returned home.